Satyar Swarup Mishra was really the first to think in terms of an out of India scenario. Well, I mean, the out of India scenario was thought up in the 18th century. They, of course, thought about it. But so in about roughly 1840, it was discarded, the out of India.
Out of India theory. So the out of India theory posits that India is the cradle of Proto-Indo-European, and Indo-European languages dispersed from India to the rest of the Indo-European world.
Yeah, so that when you keep that sequence in mind, when you read the geographical place names mentioned, you see that it's an east to west gradient. And so if the Aryan Invasion Theory were true, they would start in Afghanistan. They would end up at the Ganga at the end. Now, exactly the opposite is the case.
So another question I would like to ask you is about the Laryngeal theory in Indo-European linguistics and its importance for the field.
Yeah. In the 19th century, Ferdinand de Saussure thought up, purely theoretically, that the structure of Indo-European had gaps in it, and that these laryngeal consonants, which are formed deep in the throat.
Like for instance? Like for instance, ha? No?
Yes, or even worse.
Oh.
I mean, if a vowel follows, then it becomes hearable, audible. But so these are consonants that exist in Semitic.
As in Khalid.
For example, so you have the hard H, and you have the fricative ha. But you also have, and here we really come to to real laryngeals. You have the ah. You have the glottis, the glottal stop.
Yes.
Stop, and you have an even heavier version of it. You have the usual glottis that you have in most languages, only it's not marked as a separate letter. You say apple, you jump into the water, so to speak, to start the vowel a, you make this glottal stop. And so you have a harder version of it. So that's the Hebrew letter Ayin. So these letters exist, only they're not attested in Indo-European. So he said, well, and they have left traces in existing Indo-European languages. So this is most clear in Greek. A laryngeal must have existed where now you have a vowel. For example, you have the well-known Sanskrit root nara, meaning man, like in nirpa, the protector of men,
Yes.
meaning the king. So in Greek this becomes aner. You must have originally had something like anar, and so in Greek this becomes aner. So there it's clear that where they have existed. So they've been vocalized, but they have a presence. And in most languages that is not the case, but they leave traces. Like where originally you had two vowels with a laryngeal in between, they form separate syllables. Later, they still retain some of the separateness, whereas in other situations, two vowels bordering each other are going to merge or have some other phonetic effect that in this case you don't have. I mean, it is usually going to affect the adjoining vowels. The Saussure thought that you had something, again, like in Northwest Caucasian, we discussed that earlier, the consonant clusters that are typical of Northwest Caucasian, those you will also find here. And so in some extreme cases of Northwest Caucasian languages, you have practically no vowels. You have a and then adjoining consonants. And so something like that he also thought. So you had very few vowels in Proto-Indo-European, but because of the combination with a laryngeal that has subsequently disappeared, you get a distinct a, e, o, and that's one, according to him, one of the traces that the laryngeals have left. And so now when you look at Indo-European etymology, you always get this H1, H2, or H3 combined with more normal letters. So not everybody was pleased with this. So people said, the well-known argument against Reconstruction is, oh, it's a ghost language, it never existed. You think this up, but who says that it's real? So here also, it's hypothetical, so it's a nice thing in the sense that it has helped in the creation of structuralism, the fact that things only have their essence from the part that they play in a larger whole, the way that they function in a structure. Many people, men of science, said, well, that's all very interesting, but I don't see any of this. And like, there's a book about Indo-European by a Hungarian linguist Gyula Deci, who devotes a very, very little chapter to the laryngeals, where he dismisses them as the infamous laryngeal theory.
Okay.
And so he says, and many say, the only language where they actually appear, which wasn't known at the time of the Saussure yet, namely Hittite. So Hittite was more or less discovered late 19th century and only deciphered by 1917 or so. And so in Gyula Deci's time it was well known. But so he said, well, yes, it did exist. It did exist in Hittite, but look at the location of Hittite. You see, Hittite is very near the Semitic languages. It has an enormous influence from Akkadian. And so these sounds must be an influence of Akkadian or Semitic in general, because the other Indo-European languages don't have them, don't have these sounds, and they are not bordering Semitic. And so it's easy to explain, it's just an influence from Semitic. So not everybody, but I mean, these are really fringe cases. So right now everybody accepts it, and so any dictionary or so of Indo-European, you will find the use of the laryngeals.
So you'll have H1, H2, H3?
Yes.
Okay. So if I remember correctly, our Indian linguist Satya Swarup Mishra,
yes,
he made some arguments against laryngeals. Why was that?
Yeah, I read that like 35 years ago. I'm sorry.
Okay.
No, what is interesting, what I do remember of his work, is that he discusses the relation between Indo-Aryan and the Gypsy language. And he says that you see many of the phenomena, if you study the relation between the different branches of Indo-European, you find back, or you find interesting variations on them in the relation between Romani, the Gypsy language, and the sort of Hindi, Prakrit that it stems from. So the Gypsies left India in about 1000 CE. And so it's still very much an Indo-Aryan language. Mm-hmm. There is the case of an Indian student in Leiden who heard a few gypsies speaking with one another, and to his surprise, he could more or less follow. So it's still considerably Indo-Aryan, even though, of course, over the centuries it has absorbed lots of other influences. He argues that Romani has lost some typically Indian characteristics, the way that all the other branches also have. So it is argued that Proto-Indo-European did not have palatal or retroflex sounds. No Shadyantra or so. And so they say, oh yeah, it is in India that it has acquired these sounds under the influence of Dravidian or Munda or so. Today all Indian languages have these sounds. And I mean all of them, and specifically Indian languages. Like for instance, some people say that Dravidian is derived from Proto-Elamite. Now, Elamite does not have these sounds. Whether it is cognate or not, even if cognate, in this respect at least it is different. You see, Vietnamese does not have it, but Munda does have it. They're cognate, but in this respect they're different. At the time when they were still spoken languages, Avestan and Sanskrit were practically mutually understandable.
Yes.
Yet Sanskrit has them, Avestan does not. So lately I've been writing about the Indian national symbols, and it occurred to me, you see, if you look in the encyclopedia, you have a national bird, and a national, elephant and Bengal tiger and so on, national this, national that. And actually, this sound is so typically Indian that, I'd be the first country, if I were you, to declare a national consonant.
Which would be a shra.
Well, the sa, yes, the laryngeal sound. Everybody else says, you see, Indo-European does normally not have these sounds. Only the Indo-Aryan languages have them because they entered India, where all the other languages also have it. And so he argues it's just the other way around. So the example of Gypsy proves precisely that languages that leave India lose these sounds.
Oh.
And because, in the case of Proto-Indo-European, the debate is still on. Whereas in the case of the Gypsy languages, it's well known what happened.
Yes.
They left India, so they were retroflex, and they lost the retroflex sounds. So the same thing may have happened on a larger scale. As Talageri also informs me, when expatriate Indians, you see, after 20 years in America, come back home on a family visit, you can hear that these sounds have greatly eroded in their speech. So, it's normal that people lose this. And so this must have happened back then, 5,000 years ago also. Anyway, that's his position. Another is, you had earlier, maybe only after the laryngeals, it may be an effect of the laryngeals, that's under debate, but at any rate, you had a differentiation between the different vowel sounds. And so in Sanskrit you see these vowels, it's A, A, O, coincide into A, like you had the sound Gegoma, that becomes Jagama. So here he also argues, you have in the course of the history of the Gypsy language the opposite, the inverse tendency. They, start with the common A sound and they differentiate it as they forget about India. Anyway, that's his position. So that hasn't made any impact, and I don't know exactly what to think about it either, but let's keep that in mind. It may prove useful at some point.
So, with that, we come to the next section, which is about Indo-European studies in India and about India. So,
Well, okay, let me let me immediately say something about this that connects with the earlier, namely that Satya Swarup Mishra was really the first to think in terms of an out of India scenario.
okay.
Well, I mean, the out of India scenario was thought up in the 18th century. They, of course, thought about it, but so in about roughly 1840, it was discarded, the out of India. And so the first one to revive it, to really revive it, I mean, there are first people who doubt the Aryan invasion scenario, like Jim Sheffer and other archaeologists. But to think up the reverse scenario, that takes an extra effort. How is this possible? Why would this have happened and so on? Rather full scenario developed by Shrikant Talageri. But the first one to think in those terms is this Satya Swarup Mishra. He thinks out of India. And so he tries to show at the linguistic level, not yet at any other, but at least at the linguistic level, he creates a scenario where, it makes sense that the typically Indo-Aryan forms evolve into forms that are more similar to the other branches. Yes.
Okay, so that's very good. So welcome to India. So in India at least, we have the general accepted model is that Aryans at some point in history, Bronze Age times, they came into India and Aryanized at least the northern part of India, right? That is the so-called Aryan invasion or Aryan immigration theory. Now, as you have said, people like Satya Swarup Mishra have found something that indicates that India could be the homeland of the Proto-Indo-European language. So now we don't have any decipherment, at least no satisfactory decipherment of the Harappan language. Is that a real key, a conclusive decipherment of the Harappan language, or can that issue be bypassed?
Well, we are bypassing it at the moment. We are not drawing any conclusions from any of the existing decipherments. And so maybe the question can be solved without decipherment. But of course, if the decipherment is there, then that will have a whole lot of consequences. Again, as we speak, this Yajnia Devam, I think he lives in the States, but is touring India at the moment, giving lectures about his decipherment. Unlike earlier attempts, his way to go about it has method, namely that of cryptography. You heard about the decipherment of the Enigma code in the Second World War, and so on. Well, you see, he uses that method to read, cryptographic scripts, and he applies that here. And so I'm in opposition to judge his method. I only notice that, contrary to most others, he has method. That's already a big step. Now, his result is that he found the language to be Sanskrit. And so, in his opinion, it makes sense. The decipherments he gets are real sentences, really make sense in the context in which they appear, which is better than most decipherments that have gone before. You see, typically they fit those signs that this decipherer has paid attention to, but when new scripts, new logos or whatever they are, new seals are shown, then it doesn't work anymore. Or a giveaway of a false result is the contents. You see, these Sanskritic decipherers usually come up with something very bombastic, very, high-flown, in the case of Sumerian, the first writing that we have is bookkeeping. Very down to earth, very simple. And so in the case of the Harappan script, they suddenly start talking about the gods and, being and reality, and that's not very likely. Although, of course, if you care for religion, then religion will perhaps be the first thing that you devote something serious as the new invention of writing. At any rate, you see, he makes bold that he has really deciphered it, that his decipherment really works. Just at the same time, there is another decipherment by Stephen Bonta, who started with the assumption that it was Dravidian, and it didn't work. And, after all the work he had already done, he said, okay, let's try Sanskrit. And that did work. Like in Dravidian, you have this agglutinative tendency, which means that all kinds of suffixes are added to a word. Whereas in Indo-European, these suffixes are combined, like for example, in a certain word you can notice the number. Is it singular, plural, dual?
Yes.
The case, is it a dative or a genitive or what? The gender, masculine, feminine, neuter.
Neuter, yeah.
And so that's all in one suffix. If you say in Latin bonai and not bonus, it means feminine plural. In the nominative plural, yeah. Whereas in agglutinative languages, you have to have separate suffixes for gender, for number, and so on. And so that's a big difference between the Dravidian and Indo-European, though much less so than, for instance, with Uralic. Anyway, for Bonta, it was sufficient ground for seeing the Dravidian language structure clash with the data he found, whereas it would work with Indo-European. So at the moment, you see the mood among out of India theorists is rather upbeat, because this would be a strong argument for India being the homeland. At any rate, India being much earlier Indo-European than the Aryan Invasion Theory assumes.
Yes.
But let's see. Let's see.
But
so far we've been doing without decipherment.
And yes, we have been doing without the decipherment. And the other thing is that you said agglutinative. But wouldn't Sanskrit terms also have agglutinative properties? Because you have vibhakti, you have vachan, and you add suffixes to all of them?
No, in Latin, in Greek, and Sanskrit, you have the same phenomenon, that these are all, welded into one suffix.
They are not separable, in other words.
Yeah.
Okay.
If it ends in like anam, it's a genitive plural. You don't have to take the genitive and the plural into separate suffixes that are added.
Okay. So, anyway, coming back to the Harappan script, there is also this thing called Frawley's paradox.
Yes.
Right? In which I think David Frawley first pointed out that the Vedas are literature without archaeology, and the Harappans are archaeology without literature.
Yes.
So,
yes, of course. I don't think he was the first. To my knowledge, he was original with the idea. He didn't take it from anyone. Nevertheless, this objection has been formulated earlier by the great historian R.C. Majumdar.
Oh, R.C. Majumdar himself.
Yes.
Okay.
And anyway, once you start familiarizing yourself with this this problem, you ought to notice that this is bizarre. That you see these, literary developments and archaeological developments are totally divorced. And so I think that's a very valid argument. You see, the Vedic culture should have some archaeological, presence. The Harappan culture, apart from leaving behind many cities that have been dug up, of course also did have a literature. We know it was literate. We have the script, only we haven't deciphered it. And whether the one literature has anything to do with the other, that is of course the question. If you know anything about Harappan literature, is it the same as Vedic literature or not? And so that's really the question that we are asking. Now, in terms of archaeological reality of Vedic civilization, according to the late B. Bilal, there is plenty. And so he says, you see, many things that we find in Harappan cities are Vedic. And for example, he argues that some fireplaces we find are Vedic altars, and clearly distinct from cooking fires. And you see, in some sites you have both, so you can easily see the difference, you can see what is what. And that's what he argues. I mean, I'm not an archaeologist, no authority here, but I quote what he says. He, of course, shows many things that still exist today, like sindoor in the parting of a married woman's hair, like greeting namaste and so on. Now, against that, of course, you can say, well, maybe the Vedic Aryans, when they came in, they didn't just kill everyone. No, you see, they lived somewhat together, and they assimilated and so on. And so they took over some habits like namaste. That's possible. But so, he finds many things, and so especially the depictions. I mean, he shows that many, pictures that we see actually depict Vedic themes. Some Vedic myths and so on are there. Also, that's one of the most spectacular things that in his material. Some of the fables, some of the stories from the Panchatantra are depicted. And so that clearly shows continuity. Again, here, from the other side, you might think of scenarios that would explain how the Vedic people took over elements from the Harappans and so on. You could say that's not proof, it's a strong indication.
Yeah. So
then you have, things like horses. That's much debated. People say, yeah, but you see, Harappa had no horses. There are a number of finds of horses in the Harappan cities. Here, again, you see, this is something I haven't studied, but I've participated in a few archaeologist conferences where most Indian archaeologists don't believe in the Aryan invasion, even though they have their own career reasons and so on to not go too public with this. So they do see a certain amount of evidence for the Vedic presence in the Harappan cities. Long story, so about horses, they insist that a few horses have been found, bones of horses have been found, even in the south, that is to say the Gujarat coast, even there, because from the Vedas we know that Vedas are hardly indigenous because they are being bought from Afghanistan, from the Kamboja people. And so for horses, Central Asia is the right kind of climate, whereas India is not at all. So in Indian, like in Indian history, in the wars in the Middle Ages when the Turks invade, so they bring fresh horses from Central Asia. You see, the Indian horses have an ancestry going back to Central Asia, but for generations already they've been in this completely
Different
tiring climate of India, and so the other horses are much better. So, you know, they buy horses from Central Asia. Admittedly, you see, horses are not natural to India. Nevertheless, horses were very much present in India.
Yeah. So, but the other argument I have heard is that the horse bones appear only at the later Harappan stages and not in the earlier ones.
Yeah, well,
I mean, and they are very
Interesting.
sparse. But the other part is that, I mean, given the importance of the horse to the
yeah,
Vedic literature, unlike somewhere like Sintashta or the Central Asian
Yes.
cultures, you don't find elaborate horse burials or burials involving horses and so on in India. I mean,
you don't find elaborate human beings being buried. You
either.
know, this stuff like in Egypt, you know, where
All-
all buildings, you know, serving as the
dedicated.
grave of the pharaoh. Nothing like that in India.
Nothing like that. But we do have some burials in Mohenjo-daro
Yes,
and
yes, true.
Rgvedic, which has been. But the material seems to be very sparse in terms of
Yes.
biological material. Could they have had cremation that early?
Well, that's what I've been thinking from the beginning.
Yeah.
So that leaves few traces, of course. Yes.
Unfortunately, yeah. Okay, so the we have talked, you know, tangentially about the out of India theory. So the out of India theory posits that India is the cradle of Proto-Indo-European and Indo-European languages dispersed from India to the rest of the Indo-European
Yeah.
world. So, as you said, it was in favor in the beginning, and then it fell out of favor, and then you mentioned Talageri's work. So, what is the key in Talageri's work which made him say that this could be an out of India theory rather than an into India theory?
Well, he reread the Rig Veda, which contains plenty of historical information.
Okay.
So the argument of some religious types in India that no, there's nothing so down to earth as human history in the Vedas, you know, that can safely be rejected. European historians in the 19th century didn't have that kind of taboo, you know, that kind of inhibition. They studied what much historical material they could find in there. So that is what, then for a long time nobody cared about it, and so this is what Talageri has now looked into again. And so what he found, for example, found is that there is a clear east to west gradient. You see, the different books of the Rig Veda can be dated. And so it's a layered text, you know, you have older parts and middle parts and younger parts.
So just to
That's
clarify
not-
here for our viewers,
Yes.
even if we cannot absolutely date the Vedas, we can assign a relative chronology
Yes.
to each of the books or mandalas.
Yes. And so that's not Talageri's own contribution. That work has been done already by mainly by
Edward Hopkins,
Edward Hopkins, but I was looking for
Oldenburg.
Oldenburg, yes. Oldenburg, that's it. So he mapped out the layeredness of the Rig Veda. And so, and it's not chronological, it's not the first book oldest and the 10th book youngest. The oldest book is the 6th, then followed by the 3rd and the 7th. And so you have the 8th, which is like a first last book in the sense that it was the first to count as the last book. There were no 9th and 10th yet. Then the 9th was added, and then centuries later the 10th was added. So, but you have the sequence, And so that when you keep that sequence in mind, when you read the geographical place names mentioned, you see that it's an east to west gradient. And so if the Aryan Invasion Theory were true, they would start in Afghanistan. They would end up at the Ganga at the end. Now, exactly the opposite is the case. So the Ganga, from the beginning, is well known, is part of their world, whereas they only come in Afghanistan in the later books. In the 8th book, suddenly you get wool sheep, you get camels and so on, you get the stuff of Afghanistan, which earlier isn't there.
Okay.
And that's a first strong indication.
Yeah. But one thing is there, for people who are disagreeing with Talageri, it would actually be very simple to just prove that the relative chronology of the books is wrong. If you really wanted to do this, right?
Yeah.
Then that would mean overturning around 100 years of scholarship.
Yeah.
That's what it will take. If you want to disprove this east to west gradient.
Yeah.
Right. Otherwise, I think Talageri bases most of his thesis on this fundamental fact of layeredness and the particular sequence of books.
Right, but you see, Hindu traditionalists ought to be convincible because an important element that they take serious is genealogy. And so within families you see people mentioned, you also see a sequence which follows the genealogical tree. And there, of course, you have to have bits and pieces that have to be, pieced together. But at any rate, you do not find an alternative chronology. So, the established chronology is satisfactory. And it shows something else than an Aryan invasion.
Not an Aryan influx into India, but rather out of India. Or at least to India's west.
Yeah.
That's what we can say. So there is this language Burushaski, right?
Yeah.
So is there any evidence of borrowings between Burushaski and Indo-Aryan or vice versa?
I haven't heard of any.
Okay.
I personally don't know Burushaski, read some papers about it. And interesting in there, you see there's one fellow who tried to, Chasule, who tried to show that it is Indo-European, and he doesn't make a convincing case. However, the words that he uses as evidence are interesting because they suggest that the language was in contact with Sanskrit at an early date, and not just with Sanskrit, but even with Proto-Indo-European, or at least with an earlier Indo-European. Here again, all very shaky. But the interesting thing is that that could be added to the cases already existing of languages that look like the Western branches of Indo-European and that happen to be in India, like Proto-Banghani. Or like earlier you had the discovery of Tokharic, which is not inside India, just north of India, but at least is not in the place where you would expect it in the established theory.
Okay. So similarly, when something happens with Brahui that we discussed earlier, because it could be a remnant of the Elamite migration, postulated Elamite migration, or a later migration of Dravidian speakers.
Of course, some Indian nationalists are up in arms against the Dravidian immigration theory. I don't know if it's true or not. I don't have that concern to deal with. And so I would say, well, if it comes from Elam, from Iran, so what?
It's still...
it certainly doesn't have an impact on the present question of whether there is an immigration of Indo-European. So there may be other immigrations, like of Munda, that definitely immigrated from Southeast Asia. So maybe Dravidian also immigrated.
Yes. So getting back to Shrikant Talageri's work, you have stated that you you accepted the consensus in terms of Aryan invasion earlier, and his work made you change your mind considerably.
Yeah.
Can you just recount how that happened?
Well, I think it is mostly due to Talageri. Yes, of course. So I mean, I knew that the issue was becoming more debatable again. It seemed to be fixed. What I learned in university was that this matter had been decided. So that became open again. So I was interested, but not, I didn't know. And so when I read Talageri, I said, my God, you see this, these are very strong arguments. And so that's how I rolled into the out of India case.
And what about Nicholas Kazanas? How did he come to his, he's also an out of India theorist. How did he come to his conclusions?
Well, by studying the language. I mean, this happens that, scholars convert because of their studies. I mean, in religion you have the same thing. In the scene of the podcasts and YouTube and so on, you have a number of videos by Professor Bart Ehrman, a scholar of the New Testament. And so he describes himself how, his deeper and deeper knowledge of the New Testament made him see, well, the version that the church teaches can't be correct. And there are a number of that. You see, in Europe, this used to happen in the 19th century or so. But so it's happening under our eyes in America, where specialists of Christianity are losing the faith. So the same thing happens in linguistics, apparently, once in a while. So he used to teach the Aryan invasion version of ancient Indo-European, and he changed his mind.
So Shrikant Talageri has put up a lot of evidence saying that the Vedic language is more ancient than is currently accepted.
Yes.
Right. So how far back in chronology can you push Vedic?
Well, not that far. I mean, there are in India all kinds of wild theories about 50,000 years ago, and I don't know how many more. No, so he pushes it back only like 1500 years. It's a Bronze Age text. Now you see the Bronze Age starting in about 3500 or so BCE, so not that far ago. And so the Rig Vedic can't be before that. Then at the end of it, you see Iron Age used to be taken to start in like 1000 BC. Right now we know it started a lot earlier. In fact, iron, the working of iron was invented in India, in South India moreover. And so you see here, we may take the Iron Age to start in India in like 1800 BCE. And so the Veda is before that.
Okay, but the Vedas are clearly a Bronze Age text. There is no evidence of iron in them.
That's not the only thing to date it. Yeah, I mean, that is a matter of agreement. Again, you see, of course, we can also question things that are not in doubt so far. But in this case, there are other arguments. So there is the intertextuality. You find interesting chronology in the Puranas, where you have to be very careful, because there's also a lot of nonsense in the Puranas. You have to sift carefully, you see what you can trust.
Grain from chaff.
Yeah, but so forget about these texts, you see, or well, at least you need the mediation of text to get at certain information, namely astronomical observations. And there, you see, it's as clear as you can get. You have a number of datable astronomical observations. Now, which are datable? So, non-datable are, for example, eclipses. You see, there are a number of eclipses mentioned in the Rig Veda and all the other writings, especially in the Mahabharata, full of astronomical detail. But so eclipses happen every month. Or, I mean, if you stay in one place, then maybe every few years or so, but they happen very regularly. You see, on that basis, you can't say, oh, it's 1500 BC or it's 3000 BC. However, what you do have is the precession of the equinoxes. And so this means that you can see the stars moving vis-a-vis the seasons at the rate of 1 degree of arc in 71 years. So that's slow enough to be usable for these purposes. And so you have, and for now I'll give the most famous case. You have the mention of Magha or Regulus, the heart of the lion, passing the solstice axis. You have it in several, for instance, in the Kaushitaki Brahmana, which is not even the Vedas, it's an auxiliary text to the Vedas, which is a little bit later, or which started already to be written while the Vedas, or to be composed while the Vedas were being composed, but certainly not earlier than the Vedas. So that particular stellar event, attested a number of times, is in about the 23rd century BCE.
23rd century BCE?
Yes. And so we therefore know that the Rig Veda started to be composed earlier than that.
Okay.
It's an interesting case because it has been noticed by earlier Indologists. And so there is a book, the Vedic Index, by Keith and MacDonald from early 20th century. And that it's a very famous book. I mean, I think most students of Indology go through it at some point. Now, that notes this stellar position, that admits it is 2200 BC, and then somehow concludes, oh yeah, this must be referring to 800 to 600 BC. You know, that's, I think that's bad scholarship. You know, turning around, data like that, here the data clearly mean what they mean. And, if it's just one case, you could still say, yeah, but maybe something happened. But the thing is that the, dozen or so of such astronomical data involving the Rig Veda, because in later texts there are many more, but for that early period there are only a few, but still, you see, these all converge on a very coherent scenario. You see, it's not like you have an old text and a much later text, which, on the text itself you see, for instance, that this fellow calls this fellow his ancestor. No, it's not, and yet the stellar positions in there are that this text, this younger text, refers to older stellar positions than the old text. That would be confusing, and that would indicate that, foul play has happened at some point. That doesn't happen at all. It's a totally consistent chronology that results. And not one stellar indication, not one indicates the Aryan Invasion chronology. You see, the chronology that now everybody uses is the one of Friedrich Max Müller, who came up with this date that now everybody repeats of 1500 BCE.
And which he retracted, as we said here earlier.
Yes. So, you see, that's not supported by anything, certainly not by these astronomical data we are discussing, nor by anything else. Everybody believed him because he was a big name. But, his own closest colleagues said, yeah, well, this is not good enough because, it's not based on anything, and it creates a chronology that is too compressed. You can't explain all the changes in language, in ideas, from the early Veda to, for instance, the Buddha. And so then he, studied it again, and he said, I was too, too rash. There is really no evidence for this dating. Then you see he threw up his hands and pessimistically said, we will never know. You see, that is way too pessimistic. I mean, I think we do know by now.
Yeah.
But so at any rate, he himself said, you see, that dating that everybody accepts is actually based on nothing.
Okay.
And so, you see, in Indo-European conferences like the ones I mentioned, I have never ever gotten an answer to, what is this based on? Why do you assume 1500 BCE?
Okay. So the other thing is that for astronomical observations, you also have to be at a certain latitude, right? So would these astronomical observations make more sense in a location which is north of India rather than in India?
Yeah, well, for these indications, that's not material, because this relation between the stars and the seasonal points, the solstices and so on, that remains the same.
Okay.
What that refers to is there is an indication in, I think, the Vedanga Jyotisha. At any rate, there is a written indication that the biggest length of the day in the year, which is in summer solstice, is 3/5 of 24 hours, and the other extreme is 2/5. And so you see in northern countries like my own, in summer it remains sunshine till 10 o'clock in the evening. And in winter it's already dark when you go home from school at 4:30 or so. Whereas here, there's hardly such difference. And I mean, if you go close to the equator, it's hardly there. So that indeed correlates with latitude. And so that particular observation, I remember working on it like 25 years ago. That corresponds with Kashmir, and it has the same latitude as, I think, Babylon, which was a great center of astronomical research.
Yeah.
So it is Pingri, I think. You see, Pingri is always quoted as for matters of ancient astronomy, who says, you see, this must come from Babylon, this is adopted from Babylon, just as he says of many things that are adopted from the Greeks. Well, that's not necessary, that's not impossible, of course, but that creates an extra thing that you have to explain. What did they have to do with Babylon? Is there any proof of,
as opposed to directly observing it where they are?
Yes, exactly. So, not needed to make things more complicated, though sometimes, of course, the more complicated scenario is the one that actually happened. You shouldn't absolutize this Occam's razor,
exactly,
as they call it. So it's a quick rule, in practice, but ultimately, if you definitively want to judge a matter, it's not good enough. So it's possible that the complicated scenario of borrowing all the way from Babylon does obtain, but there's no indication for it. We can do without it.
Actually, the borrowing from Babylon might say that the Vedas represent not a pastoral people but actually settled people, because then you would go trading with Babylon and then you would get these ideas back. Right?
Well, in the 8th book of the Rig Veda, you do see international trade.
Okay.
You do see that they cross the sea. You see Akkadian loan words, a few of them.
So the 8th book, we may say, is the later book.
Yes.
It's a later book.
So that's when they go northwest into Afghanistan. That's when they also do sea trade.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you say that there are Akkadian loan words in
Yes.
there. Like what?
Bekanata means a money lender.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a few terms from the sphere of trade. Of course, again, you see, this is certainly not proof in itself. You can find many, ways for these things to happen. So again, these are just indications. But if you add them all together, they make a strong case for, the Vedic the Vedic culture being entirely native.
Native and also not a nomadic culture. Not a nomadic culture necessarily. The Vedic people are not necessarily nomadic.
No.
Pastorals. No.
Is it that is there at some point? Of how many people is this a description? Because there are very many parts in the Vedas where you don't get those indications. Is this in particular circumstances? Is this their normal way of life and so on? We are not done with that study of the text itself.
Okay. So there is much to do.
Yeah.
So in the sense of material objects, even before Shrikant Talageri, there was K.D. Sethna,
Yes.
disciple of Sri Aurobindo.
Yes.
He had brought up an argument about karpasa, which is cotton. So can you explain how that came about?
Yes. This is before the archaeological findings by Western archaeologists. So it's in 82, 84 that Jim Sheffer and what's her name, Diane Lichtenstein, come with the statement that, whatever we find, you see, what we have found on the ground or what we find in the literature, there is no proof of this Aryan immigration, or as it was called at that time, invasion. So Satan had nothing to do with that. And so he's one of the first Indians to start researching the question of whether there was an invasion or not. Many people had an opinion about that, but he started researching it. And not that many people had an opinion about it. Because, you see, the whole debate is among Europeans. Sometimes Europeans settled in India. You see, the colonizers or missionaries. But the Indians themselves did not take part in it. So in the 50s, 60s, then there are a few writings that I only know thanks to Indian friends. They're like in Telugu or so. And they're not very, rich and certainly not professional in arguments, but it starts. And the probably first Indian that really takes a stand is Sri Aurobindo, and only very cursorily. He comments, at that time in the West it was still race thinking and so on, which is easy to shoot down, so that he does. But so he goes into the linguistics very briefly. And so he says, in Sanskrit, words that are related to words, in other branches, are part of an organic, network. So he gives the example, wolf. Wolf in Sanskrit, vrka. And so he says, yes, but you see, that looks like the verbal root avrk, which means to tear. So wolf here literally has a meaning, that terror. Whereas in English, wolf is just wolf. No other meaning, no related verb or so. Later you have, to wolf down something. If you're very hungry and very hurried in eating, that you call to wolf down. but that's later, and that's built on the existing noun wolf, in only the sense wolf.
So in the case of wolf, the noun becomes a verb.
Yes.
Here you have a verb becoming a noun.
Right.
In the case of vrka.
Yes. Now I've a friend of mine who is rather top-ranking Indo-Europeanist argues against that immediately. He says, no, Aurobindo, he's misled by this and that. And so he claims, you see, that this argument isn't valid. Anyway, it gave me an idea that, in fact, there are more words like that. So I thought up a few. Like, for instance, you have a root su, like you have in Savitr, the creator, the
Savitra.
Yes, the sun.
Mm-hmm.
And so a derivative of that is sunu, son, the father and son. Now, in all the other languages, a son, that word exists in most of the branches, but it only means son. There's no verbal relation anymore.
It is irreducible.
Yeah, exactly. Then father itself is pater. Now the root pa has disappeared in most places, except as a component of the word father. In Sanskrit it means to protect, like Nurpa, the protector of men, meaning the king, or Gopa, the protector of the cow, and so on. And so I mean, with my very hurried lifestyle and so on, I didn't stay with the subject long enough to find more. So I found a few words that I thought, or nam. Sanskrit has a verb namami, to greet, to address. And so all the branches have this word nam in some form or other.
As a name.
Yes, name. And don't have the concomitant verb, which Sanskrit does. So in Sanskrit it is a derivative of this verbal root namami, to greet. It's a well-known term. It actually means to bow, like the Japanese do. Which is why you find it also as the root of namaz. You see, a Persian or, ultimately Avestan, so very related to Sanskrit. The word for now Islamic prayer, where you bow. And so there you still have a more recognizable, more transparent.
By the way, the Arabic word for prayer is salat.
Yes.
Right? Whereas the Persian word for prayer is namaz.
Exactly.
And that's a Semitic language, this is an Indo-Iranian language.
Now, I did only a few of these words and then I forgot about it. Fortunately, Nicholas Kazanas really went into the subject and made a list of hundreds of these words. So that adds up to a real argument, I think.
So the other branches have lost memory of these roots,
yes.
Whereas Sanskrit and Vedic probably retain them.
Right.
Okay, so that's very interesting. And coming back to Karpasa.
That's what we're talking about. Okay, so let's first start with that word. Where does it come from? So it means cotton. It is Witzel, I think, who says that this ka may be an example of one of the prefixes in his theory of para munda. He says, you see, these munda prefixes appear in a number of Sanskrit words. And so this is an example. So what you have is originally ka, pasa. And so the ultimate root is pasa, pas. And it so happens that this is related to a word with a related or similar meaning, which exists in a number of Asian languages, including Chinese. There it is now pronounced pu. You wouldn't immediately see the connection. But I mean, in the case of Chinese, there are many serious changes in vowel. Like the root ma, which exists interestingly both in Arabic and in Sanskrit, meaning no or don't. So you have that in Chinese also in the form u. Like in wu wei, you know, the famous Taoist term, not doing, doing nothing. So what is implied here is that this cotton plant, you know, is quite widespread and has a word that, you know, followed the spreading of the plant. And so you find this root again, you know, in Chinese, in Sanskrit, and in other languages, which is interesting. I don't know if it's true or not. Anyway, now, what does Sethna do with this? Well, he shows that the word Karpasa is present in the Vedas. Sorry, is not present in the Vedas. It appears only in post-Vedic literature, whereas it is present in the Harappan cities. So he concludes, you see, such an easy commodity that we know has been present in India all along. You see, once it is there, it can't disappear. Even if people leave the cities, you know, if the cities get dilapidated and so on, if you come to a post-Harappan phase, it's unthinkable that this commodity is going to disappear.
It's just like grain.
Yeah.
It's going to stay.
Right. It's going to stay. So, if the Vedas didn't have it, it means they were pre-Harappan.
Okay.
Yes. Now, you see, not being very familiar with material culture, archaeology and so on, I hesitate to have an opinion on that. Nevertheless, if you want my opinion, I mean, there aren't many other explanations. Nevertheless, that the Vedas are pre-Harappan, I think is very doubtful. I think they are Harappan. I mean, that's that age. Or starting with early Harappan, but certainly also including the urban Harappan phase, which is 2600 to 1900 BCE. So there is certainly an overlap between the Harappan cities and the Vedas. So to say, you know, the fact that Karpasa is not mentioned implies that they are pre-Harappan. I can see where that reasoning comes from, but I'm not convinced.
And it is an argument from silence again.
Yes.
So, I mean, they may not have reason to mention Karpasa.
Yeah.
That's it.